Wondered why certain emotions cling to you like shadows, refusing to disappear no matter how desperately you try to outrun them? Why does guilt gnaw at your core without any clear source? Or why does that persistent voice whisper that you'll never be enough? Perhaps you've blamed your circumstances, your demanding job, your complicated relationships, the endless cycle of daily struggles. But what if I told you that the chains binding you today weren't forged in the present moment? What if the prison you find yourself in was built long before you even understood what freedom meant? The truth is uncomfortable, but it's the only path to liberation. What trapped you now was planted in the fertile soil of your earliest relationships, in the formative bonds that shaped your psyche before you had words to describe what was happening to you. And at the center of this psychological architecture stands a towering figure, your father, or the father figure who occupied that space in your developing mind. Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, spent his life mapping the invisible territories of the unconscious mind. His discoveries, though often met with resistance, revealed a startling truth that most people still refuse to acknowledge. The figure of the father represents one of the most powerful archetypal forces in human consciousness. The way you experienced, interpreted, and internalized your father's presence or his absence during your most vulnerable years continues to orchestrate your life from the shadows of your unconscious mind. You might protest that you've moved beyond your childhood, that the past is merely prologue to your present story, but your body knows better. Your behavior tells a different tale. Look honestly at the patterns that repeat in your life like a broken record. How many times have you found yourself desperately seeking approval from others, even when it costs you your dignity? How often have you felt like a fraud, unable to recognize your own worth despite evidence to the contrary? How frequently have you sabotaged your own success before even attempting to reach for it, paralyzed by an inner voice that declares you fundamentally inadequate? Notice how you respond to authority figures, your boss, your partner, anyone who holds power over your circumstances. Do you find yourself shrinking, becoming that same frightened child trying to avoid your father's disappointment or rage? The dynamics may have changed, but the emotional responses remain remarkably consistent. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. It doesn't matter whether your father was physically present or conspicuously absent, whether he was nurturing or harsh, authoritarian or permissive. Each variation leaves its own distinctive mark on your psyche. An absent father creates a void that you spend your entire life trying to fill, often through relationships that can never satisfy that primal hunger for paternal validation. An authoritarian father installs an internal critic that becomes your constant companion, a voice that never sleeps, never rests, never declares you good enough. A weak or emotionally unavailable father may launch you on an endless quest for protective figures, or conversely it might generate an automatic contempt for anyone who attempts to guide or lead you. There is no neutral ground here. Every father, through his presence or absence, his actions or inactions, leaves an indelible imprint on your developing sense of self. Until you understand the nature of this imprint, you remain unconsciously bound to its influence, dancing to rhythms you don't even realize you're hearing. Freud understood that this influence extends far beyond individual psychology. In his groundbreaking works Totem and Taboo and Civilization and Its Discontents, he demonstrated how the paternal archetype shapes entire cultures and civilizations. The fear, guilt, and repression inherited from what he called the primordial father become the invisible forces that sustain social institutions, moral codes, and systems of authority that govern our collective existence. But before you can hope to transform the world around you, you must first confront the world within you. You must be willing to examine the relationship you built or were forced to build with your father figure, not through rose-colored glasses of nostalgia or the harsh lens of resentment, but with the clear-eyed vision of someone genuinely seeking truth. This isn't about surface-level analysis or pop psychology insights. This requires a deep dive into the murky waters of your unconscious mind. bringing to light what has been deliberately hidden from your awareness. It's a challenging process that will demand courage, persistence, and often professional guidance, but it's also the only process that can genuinely set you free from the invisible chains that have been governing your choices, your relationships, and your sense of what's possible in your life. Most people mistakenly believe that their problems originate in adulthood, a toxic relationship, a frustrating career, a series of personal failures. They focus on managing symptoms while ignoring the root system that continues to generate the same issues in different forms. But psychoanalysis reveals a different truth. The deepest conflicts of the human psyche are formed long before you develop the cognitive capacity to understand what's happening to you. The most powerful and universally experienced of these early conflicts has a name that has become part of our cultural vocabulary, though few people truly understand its profound implications: the Oedipus complex. Freud's detailed exploration of this phenomenon in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality represents one of the most uncomfortable yet essential discoveries in the history of psychology. Between the ages of 3 and 6, you experienced a psychological drama that would shape the rest of your emotional life. During this critical developmental phase, you began forming intense emotional bonds with your parents, but what appeared to be innocent childhood attachment concealed a complex unconscious struggle for love, power, and identity. As a young child, you naturally wanted to be the center of your mother's universe, to receive all of her love, attention, and emotional energy. This desire was pure and understandable. Every child craves the security of unconditional maternal love. But there was an obstacle to this total possession of your mother's affection: your father. He represented the rival who had already claimed the position you unconsciously desired. Even if you have no conscious memory of this period, the feelings it generated, rivalry, jealousy, desire, and most significantly, guilt, were processed by a developing mind that lacked the capacity to understand or integrate such complex emotions. You experienced unconscious desire for your opposite-sex parent, coupled with rivalry toward your same-sex parent, along with the terrifying fear of punishment for these forbidden feelings. The female experience of this developmental phase, which Carl Jung later termed the Electra complex, follows a similar but distinct pattern. Here, the father becomes the object of unconscious desire, while the mother is perceived as the rival standing between the daughter and complete paternal love. Like the male version of this complex, it generates profound feelings of guilt, fear, and internal conflict that become formative forces in the developing female psyche. The crucial point is that these conflicts didn't simply disappear as you grew older. They were repressed, buried in the deepest layers of your unconscious mind, but the emotional energy that accompanied them, the fear, guilt, shame, and confusion, remained active, continuing to shape your psychological responses long after you forgot the original source of these feelings. During this formative period, you learned that desire could be dangerous, that challenging authority figures led to punishment, and that love often came wrapped in guilt and anxiety. These pre-verbal lessons became the foundation of what Freud called the superego, that part of your mind that constantly watches, judges, and punishes your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors according to internalized standards that often seem arbitrary and harsh. Consider how these early lessons continue to manifest in your adult life. How often do you censor yourself for no apparent reason, holding back from expressing your true thoughts or desires? How frequently do you feel conflicted about wanting good things for yourself, as if success or happiness might somehow be dangerous or undeserved? How many times have you remained silent in the presence of authority figures, even when you knew you had something valuable to contribute? These responses aren't random personality quirks. They're echoes of that original psychological drama, patterns that were established when your mind was most malleable and vulnerable to lasting impression. The manifestations of unresolved Oedipal and Electra complexes are numerous and often surprising in their subtlety. You might be someone who struggles to maintain healthy romantic relationships because you constantly feel inferior or unworthy of love, unconsciously believing that you don't deserve the affection you desire. Alternatively, you might become excessively controlling or possessive in relationships, desperately trying to ensure that you'll never be replaced or abandoned, exactly the fear that haunted you in childhood. In professional settings, you might find yourself automatically deferring to male authority figures, unable to compete effectively or advocate for yourself, unconsciously replicating the dynamic where challenging the father figure felt impossibly dangerous. Or you might go to the opposite extreme, becoming compulsively rebellious toward any form of authority, constantly fighting battles that echo that original childhood struggle for autonomy and recognition. The cruelest aspect of this psychological inheritance is that because conscious memory typically doesn't extend back to this developmental period, you grow up believing that these emotional patterns and responses are simply part of your personality. You accept them as immutable aspects of who you are, never recognizing them as the residue of conflicts that could potentially be resolved with proper understanding and therapeutic work. But the Oedipal and Electra complexes represent only the beginning of your psychological journey. What happens next, how these early conflicts are internalized and transformed into ongoing psychological structures, is where the real work of understanding and healing must focus. The resolution of the Oedipal and Electra complexes doesn't happen through conscious decision or simple maturation. Instead, your unconscious mind, overwhelmed by the intensity of these conflicting emotions and unable to process them directly, finds a different solution. It internalizes the paternal figure. This internalization marks the birth of what becomes known as the paternal complex, a psychological structure that will influence your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors for the rest of your life unless you consciously choose to examine and transform it. Freud's detailed analysis in The Ego and the Id explains how this internalization process forms the foundation of the superego, that relentless internal judge that monitors your every thought and action. Your father, or more accurately, the psychological representation you constructed of him, takes up permanent residence in your mind. From this internal position, he continues to watch over you, evaluate your choices, and punish you for transgressions against standards that may have little connection to your current reality or adult values. You might object that your relationship with your father wasn't particularly significant or influential. Perhaps he was absent, emotionally distant, or simply not a major presence in your early life. But here's what makes this psychological mechanism so powerful and universal. Sometimes the more absent the father was, the more powerful the internal image you created to fill that void. The human psyche abhors emptiness, especially in such fundamental relational categories. When the actual father fails to provide a clear, consistent presence, your unconscious mind constructs a paternal figure from fragments of experience, cultural images, and psychological necessity. If your father was violent, unpredictable, or harsh, you defended yourself by creating an internal version that could anticipate and prepare for punishment, even when no external threat existed. If your father was weak, passive, or unable to provide protection and guidance, you internalized a sense that the world itself lacks safety and reliable structure. In each scenario, the child's mind doesn't process the father as he actually was. It creates a psychological father figure that serves specific defensive and organizational functions in your developing psyche. This internalized paternal figure becomes your constant companion, engaging in an ongoing internal dialogue that shapes your self-perception and your relationship with the world. The voice that tells you you're not working hard enough, not achieving enough, not worthy of love or success. This is often the internalized father speaking, applying standards and judgments that may have been relevant to your childhood circumstances, but continue to operate long after those circumstances have changed. Look at how this manifests in your current relationships. When you enter into romantic partnerships, Do you find yourself compulsively trying to please your partner, unable to set boundaries or express your needs directly? You may be unconsciously treating your partner as you once had to treat your father, carefully, deferentially, always alert to signs of disapproval or rejection. The fear of abandonment that drives you to sacrifice your authentic self in relationships often stems from that early terror of losing paternal love and protection. Alternatively, you might find yourself unable to submit to anyone, compulsively challenging authority figures, picking fights with bosses, teachers, or partners whenever you sense they're trying to exercise influence over you. This pattern, too, represents an attempt to win the battle you couldn't win against your father in childhood, except now you're fighting shadows, engaging in conflicts that exist more in your internal world than in external reality. Perhaps you're someone who lives with a constant stream of self-criticism, an internal voice that never allows you to rest in satisfaction with your accomplishments. No matter how much you achieve, you continue to feel like an imposter, waiting for someone to discover that you're not as competent or deserving as you appear. This is the superego in action, the ghost of your internalized father continuing to apply impossible standards, maintaining the psychological dynamic where love and acceptance always remain just out of reach. In more severe cases, the paternal complex influences major life decisions and career paths. You might avoid leadership positions because taking authority feels dangerous, reminiscent of challenging your father's dominance. Or you might pursue success compulsively, driven not by genuine ambition but by the desperate need to prove your worth to an internal father who can never be satisfied. Some people construct their entire professional identity around rebellion against paternal authority, becoming perpetual outsiders or critics without ever examining whether this stance serves their authentic interests. All of this happens because the child's psyche, lacking the cognitive and emotional resources to fully process such intense relational conflicts, doesn't resolve them, it represses them and transforms them into automatic psychological patterns. But as Freud demonstrated time and again, what remains unresolved in the unconscious doesn't disappear, it repeats. This brings us to one of the most insidious mechanisms that keeps these patterns active in your adult life: compulsive repetition. Freud explored this phenomenon extensively in Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, showing how the unconscious mind doesn't simply hide painful experiences, it actively seeks to work through them by recreating similar situations in the present. Your unconscious operates on the principle that if you can replay the original trauma with a different outcome, you might finally resolve the underlying conflict. But since you don't have conscious access to these early wounds, what actually happens is that you unconsciously select situations, relationships, and challenges that echo the original childhood drama, hoping that this time things will turn out differently. Consider your romantic relationships. If you consistently choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, critical, or withholding, you might be unconsciously recreating the dynamic you experienced with a distant or rejecting father. Deep in your psyche, you're attempting to finally win the love and approval that was denied to you in childhood. But because you're not consciously aware of this dynamic, you typically end up recreating the same painful patterns. The unavailable partner remains unavailable, the critical voice continues to criticize, and you experience the familiar feelings of inadequacy and rejection. In professional contexts, you might find yourself repeatedly accepting positions where you're undervalued or overlooked, unconsciously recreating the family dynamic where your contributions were dismissed or minimized. Or you might become a perfectionist, working exhaustively to meet impossible standards, driven by the unconscious hope that if you just achieve enough, the internal father will finally declare you worthy of love and recognition. A rebellion follows this pattern of compulsive repetition. The person who cannot tolerate any form of authority, who consistently challenges bosses and sabotages relationships whenever someone tries to provide guidance or structure, is often still fighting the battle against childhood paternal authority. But as long as this pattern remains unconscious, the rebellion never achieves its intended goal. It simply recreates the original conflict in new context. The most cruel aspect of compulsive repetition is that the more you try to avoid certain feelings or situations, the more inevitably you move toward them. What has been repressed, as Freud consistently demonstrated, doesn't disappear, it returns, often in disguised forms that make it difficult to recognize the original source of the pattern. You can change cities, end relationships, switch careers, or cut ties with family members, but if the underlying psychological structure remains unexamined, you'll find yourself recreating the same essential dynamics with new people in new places. The external circumstances may vary, but the emotional patterns, the relationship dynamics, and the internal conflicts remain remarkably consistent. This is why superficial approaches to personal change, positive thinking, behavior modification, or simple willpower often fail to create lasting transformation. They address symptoms while leaving the root system intact. The unconscious programming that drives compulsive repetition operates at a level that can't be reached through conscious decision-making alone, but you are not doomed to endless repetition of these patterns. The way out exists, though it requires more than good intentions or intellectual understanding. It demands a systematic approach to making the unconscious conscious, bringing hidden conflicts into the light where they can be examined, understood, and gradually transformed. The first step in this liberation process is developing genuine awareness, not just intellectual knowledge, but experiential recognition of how these patterns operate in your daily life. You must become an investigator of your own psychological processes, learning to observe your automatic reactions without immediately trying to change or justify them. Start mapping your emotional responses. When do you experience excessive guilt? When do you find yourself automatically submitting to authority without question? When does disproportionate anger arise in response to someone exercising power or influence? When do you catch yourself compulsively seeking approval or validation? Don't analyze these responses initially, simply observe and document them. For example, notice if you consistently choose romantic partners who criticize or invalidate you. Instead of focusing on their behavior, ask yourself what internal voice this dynamic serves. Does it sound like your father's voice, telling you that you're never quite good enough? When you can connect current patterns to their unconscious roots, you begin to dissolve the power they hold over you. But self-observation, while necessary, has limitations. You cannot see everything that operates in your unconscious mind through introspection alone. This is where professional therapeutic work becomes essential. Not superficial counseling focused on immediate problems, but deep therapeutic exploration designed to access and transform unconscious structures. Psychoanalysis, or psychodynamic therapy, oriented toward unconscious processes, can help you safely explore the deeper layers of your psyche. This work involves bringing repressed conflicts to consciousness, working through unresolved emotional material, and gradually redefining your relationship with internalized paternal figures. The goal isn't to blame your father or remain trapped in childhood grievances, but to free yourself from patterns that no longer serve your adult life. Choose a therapist who understands these dynamics and has training in approaches that address unconscious processes. Be prepared for work that won't be quick or comfortable, but that offers the possibility of genuine liberation from patterns that have been limiting your potential for authentic self-expression and meaningful relationships. The journey toward healing your father wound is not about forgetting your past or pretending that your early experiences don't matter. It's about understanding how those experiences continue to shape your present moment choices and relationships, and then consciously choosing to respond from your adult wisdom rather than your childhood wounds. This work requires patience, courage, and commitment, but it offers something that no external achievement or relationship can provide: the freedom to be genuinely yourself. To make choices that align with your authentic values and desires, rather than unconscious compulsions rooted in unresolved conflicts from your earliest years. The paternal complex that has been governing your life from the shadows can be transformed, but only when you're willing to turn toward it with curiosity, compassion, and the support necessary to navigate such deep psychological terrain. Your freedom lies not in escaping your history, but in understanding it so completely that it no longer controls your future.